Mike O'Gorman grew up the youngest of 8 kids. Despite the fact that some of his siblings were already moving away to college while he was in grade school, the family has remained close-knit into adulthood. They catch up during weekly Zoom calls and somehow line up all of their schedules for family vacations. So when one of the brothers needed a new kidney, it was no question that they'd all be tested to see if anyone was a donor match.
I didn't even know Pat had kidney issues until it was probably 15 or 18 months before we did the transplant. I mean, I had no idea, and that he had been kind of battling this for a while. I was just thinking, wow, that's interesting or something like that. And, kind of didn't really connect 2 and 2 that it was that severe or, oh my gosh, in less than a year, we'd be talking about, the need to, talk about a transplant.
O'Gorman says most of his siblings were ineligible for one reason or another. The National Kidney Registry says people can be disqualified due to issues with their physical or mental health. After the remaining members of the family were tested, O'Gorman was the last one standing as a match. Though it would include a major surgery and extensive recovery, there was nothing he wouldn't do for a brother.
I would not have donated a kidney to somebody, to the man off the street. The people who do that are far more altruistic than I am. I think for me, the situation was he was my brother, and I couldn't let my fears stop me from doing what I felt like I kind of had to do.
And though he felt a sense of responsibility, O'Gorman still made the choice of his own free will. Janet Amanoff is an outpatient transplant social worker at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She says that one of the first steps when considering a donor is verifying that they're not being coerced. They interview the applicants to get a sense of why they want to donate. Amanoff also investigates a donor's history of substance abuse, as well as alcohol and nicotine use. Another factor that many people may overlook is a donor's psychiatric history.
Are they stable emotionally? If they do have any underlying depression or anxiety, are they stable on medications? Do they have a psychiatrist, a therapist, a counselor? Making sure that we reach out to that therapist or counselor or psychiatrist, and making sure that we get a letter from them stating that, yes, they are in a good place in order to donate. Because after donation, there is potential for the donors to experience feelings of guilt, loneliness, where they blame themselves, abandonment, and just overall feeling like they don't have something else in their body now.
If there are any concerns about the potential donor's mental health, Amanoff will set them up to meet with the transplant psychiatrist to make sure that this experience won't be triggering. Though it's a difficult process regardless of the outcome, an unsuccessful transplant can be devastating for all parties involved.
With donation, the recipient can have a complication afterwards, and it's easy for the donor to feel guilt or to blame themselves if the recipient doesn't do well. So you want to make sure that the donor, and we do ask that question, like, would you blame yourself? Or would you feel guilty if you did donate and then the organ was unsuccessful for the recipient? We would ask that question to make sure that they've given some thought to that, or if not, that they do think about that.
For O'Gorman, while this would be his first time undergoing a major surgery, it wouldn't be his first donor experience. In 2002, his oldest brother was battling Hodgkin's lymphoma and trying any treatment available. As a last resort, they decided to do a donor stem cell transplant and tested the whole family to see if anyone was a match.
Of all my brothers and sisters, they give you certain drugs and treatments to increase the amount of stem cells that your bone marrow is producing. And then they harvest your stem cells, very much like a plasma kind of donation type of a situation. And then at that same time, during that period of time, he undergoes massive amounts of chemo, other kinds of treatments to try and kill it off, and then re-inject it in him to kind of get started.
The whole process took a few weeks, then an additional one to actually harvest the stem cells. Unfortunately, the transfer didn't go as planned.
He ended up getting graft versus host disease, which is a risk in any kind of donation, including with stem cells. And then he ended up dying of complications, from that about 3 months later after he died. And we went up for the funeral because my brother lived in Minnesota. I distinctly remember my dad coming to me after I got out of the car as we met in the hotel parking lot. And he hugged me and said, "It's not your fault. It's not your fault." And I don't think it probably to a great extent, I kind of buried that.
O'Gorman was able to take solace in the fact that the stem cell transplant was a last-ditch effort in a fight the cancer had already been winning. 6 months later, his third child was born, and O'Gorman was able to push down any residual feelings, hiding them under the chaos of life. And there they stayed until the kidney transplant team brought it up again.
And I said to him, "Gosh, I kind of almost forgot about that. Not that my brother died or not that we had done the stem cell transplant, but that, kind of that process and the graft versus host, I kind of had left that behind, I guess, to a certain extent."
Still, O'Gorman's choice was set. But despite all the preparation, the reality of donating a kidney came with other unanticipated challenges. Having never had a major surgery, O'Gorman had a pretty naive view of what the recovery would look like.
I think I had this vision that, oh, yeah, in a couple of days you'll be up. And no, it wasn't like that at all. You can't get out of bed because your stomach is killing you. Literally, they give you like a C-section cut, which, I have a lot more respect for my wife was. I said, "Oh my God, look what they did." And my wife was like, "Don't even start, pal."
While he may not have expected the hard recovery, O'Gorman was truly blindsided by the mental challenges he faced. For the first time in his life, O'Gorman was being hit with panic attacks and experiencing severe anxiety. He couldn't help but question if he had put his future health in jeopardy with this decision.
I think that going into it, I probably had buried some of my emotions and kind of what I was undertaking relative to this. We have to do this, kind of end game focus. And so that when it was over, a little bit of the reality of, oh my gosh, what did I do? Your kidneys are obviously a major, kind of organ. They not just have significant impact in your circulation system, managing blood pressure, et cetera. You have two for a reason. You just ate into your margin of error for whatever reason. And I think the anxiety of that for me came on very strong, very fast after the surgery.
Which was only exasperated by the difficulty of physically recovering from surgery. But when O'Gorman brought up his mental battles to the transplant team, it wasn't taken as seriously as he had hoped.
UIC seemed to be kind of stunned that I was having panic attacks and anxiety. They were helpful relative to some of the physical manifestations that was causing. It was causing then my blood pressure to be not controlled, but they were very reluctant to address what I would call the mental health issue. And I had never experienced this kind of thing before. And it was a real kind of breaking point, if you will, for me.
Luckily, O'Gorman was able to lean on his wife during this time to advocate for his needs. They found an outside therapist to help him work through the anxiety, but O'Gorman doesn't know if he would have found this care without a good support system at home.
UIC did a great job in terms of what I would call the medical kind of end of prepping you and those things. They spent very little time talking about what I would call the emotional impact is. Basically, you got 1 hour with a social worker, and most of that conversation was about how are you going to recover?
An important conversation, but one that doesn't hit on the emotional impact of being a donor. It's important to mention that this experience isn't universal. Transplant teams and protocols differ from center to center, and Aminoff says her hospital's procedures are a bit different. The first scheduled check-in is a week after the donation.
If there's any mental concerns at that point in time, then the social worker or the living donor, whoever, would be brought in to kind of see what's going on or how best to help them. They would then come back at 6 months, year 1, and year 2.
Outside of these scheduled times, Aminoff says it's made clear to the donor that the team is always available to help with any mental or physical concerns. Sadly, O'Gorman says that while his team was sympathetic, they didn't seem as equally equipped to help.
UIC kind of downplayed it to, well, most people are really proud of themselves for what they've done. And it's like, okay, well, you can be both proud and also kind of emotionally changed or challenged as a result of this. And so it was hard for several months. I'm sure there are other folks who do it and don't think twice about it. I'm sure there's other folks that are, in fact, kind of focused on the fact that they helped their wife or their daughter or their child or whatever it is. And that's the only thing that matters. And don't get me wrong, I am proud of what I did. And I am happy that my brother is doing well and he's doing real well. And that's important too, right? But I'm not going to lie, those first several months were a struggle.
Despite his experience, O'Gorman isn't sure what could have helped prepare him more for his newfound anxiety. He hadn't felt anxious about the procedure prior to donating, so would he have had a more positive outcome if there had been pre-surgery therapy sessions? He's not sure what the answer is, but he hopes that sharing his experience helps the transplant team tweak their program to further improve the process.
I wish I had thought of the emotional issues ahead of time. And I wish that the program had at least two things. Number one, some upfront kind of discussion of the emotional issues, as well as then two, kind of a plan or a concept which said, okay, we know if people do this, or, there may be whatever, 1 out of 20, 1 out of 40, 1 out of 100 who struggles with this. And so therefore, here's what the plan is. Because they have a plan for everything else. But this one seemed to be kind of like, oh, that's not in our protocol.
O'Gorman says that this is something anyone thinking about being a donor should consider and bring up with their transplant team. He's so proud of what he was able to do for his brother and says that if you're given the same opportunity, it's worth exploring. Understand the risks, the procedure, and ask as many questions as you need to feel comfortable with your decision. You can find more information about Janet Amanoff, Mike O'Gorman, and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.